According to a study in 2009 by cybercollege.com, the average American watches 4 hours a day of television and has the TV on for at least 51 hours per week. Along with this, by the time they're 65, the average American will have spent 9 full years of their lives just watching TV. Because of these shocking statistics, many argue just how much TV is affecting American lives. Over time, television censorship revolutionized American culture and society. Due to the reactions of the viewers, there have been many reforms over the mid-20th century to 21st century, which have caused both positive and negative changes to television programming. Censorship is defined as the action of a censor in stopping the transmission or publication of matter considered objectionable. In the TV sense, this means the blocking of the topics, pictures, language, or ideas deemed immoral or inappropriate. The ideas of censorship come from the early Roman practice, in which officials were appointed by the government to conduct the census and supervise the manners and the morals of their citizens. From the early 1950s to the early 1980s, the National Association of Broadcasters Television Code acted as a main censor in programming. Drafted in 1951 and put into effect in 1952, this code limited the amount of profanity, sex, and violence on TV, as well as cover subjects such as advancement of education and culture, responsibility towards children, controversial public issues, religious programming, advertising, and so much more. According to Thad H. Brown, Jr., the director of the National Association of Radio and Television Broadcasters, the code was developed due to a need of regulation on TV, similar to that of movie codes. One of the rules mentioned in the code was racial or nationality types shall not be shown on television in such a manner as to ridicule the race or nationality. Another rule was developing programs to foster and promote the commonly accepted moral, social, and ethical ideas characteristic of American life. Unfortunately, this was contradicted in many programs in regard to racial boundaries. Starting off, there were some indications that TV would break the racial prejudices of the time that affected print, film, and radio. In the words of Ebony magazine in the mid-1950s, TV was a colorblind medium free of racial barriers. African American singers and dancers were shown on TV. In the fall of 1952, ABC featured the first sponsored network musical show hosted by an African American, The Billy Daniels Show. Although this premiered, deeply rooted social patterns took over. Most of the consumers of the programming and products were white. The ratings during the 1950s showed that white people preferred the shows with African Americans in stereotypical roles such as maids or workers. One example of this was in shows My Little Margie, Waterfront, and particularly The Stu Erwin Show, where African American actor Willie Best played a stereotypical character who was stupid, scared of ghosts, and barely able to speak in coherent sentences. Networks began to be more sensitive to regional racial attitudes. For example, the prejudiced white South influenced segregation on TV. With the new expansion, the fear of boycotts, and other reactions by white Southern consumers, broadcasters moderated or eliminated images of racial equality in TV, going against the so-called overexposure of black guest stars, not giving support to programs hosted by African Americans, and prohibiting black and white athletes from competing with each other in sports. This went along with the Jim Crow laws of the time. It took the personal intervention of successful white men, such as Steve Allen and Ed Sullivan, to keep African American entertainers appearing on their primetime variety programs, especially as the civil rights movement became more of a heated social reality. Similar to the concept of race on TV, obscene and indecent material, also known as the amount of broadcast sexual provocativeness and profanity, was also very controversial. Broadcasters usually handled problems of language, body, and dress in terms around family viewing. Because of this, in the early 1950s, the cleavage of female performers on TV caused quite an uproar. Performers such as Dagmar on Broadway Open House and Faye Emerson on her own CBS show were a few of the women criticized for their risque wardrobes. In 1951, a councilman in Cleveland was so distraught by this new phase that he promoted the city council to pass a resolution asking the networks to stop plunging necklines. Others in Cleveland said that plunging necklines replaced talent, that such imagery tempts incompetent people seeking publicity, and that it puts a negative value on the nice, clean cotton house dress type girl. Because of the sexual imagery, parents were concerned about the sensibility of their children. Violence was also an issue when it came to censorship. Like the other topics, problems also occurred with the amount of violence on TV. Although their morals stated that crime didn't pay, they also raised much criticism. Many social groups and powerful individuals attacked the shows due to their violence. The critics began to suggest a link between crime on TV and juvenile delinquency, social violence, and immoral conduct. As early as 1949, the Southern California Association for Better Radio and Television found the violence inappropriate and not acceptable. They sent letters to stations stating, "TV comes into the home and many children are looking at these programs. We believe without too much effort, your station could substitute acceptable programs which would be suitable for family viewing." In 1951, Ernest A. Houghton of Harvard claimed that TV crime was detrimental to humanity and the result of the ignorance of movie, radio, and TV producers. In 1952, the National Association of Broadcasters Television Code came into effect, stating that criminality shall be treated as undesirable and unsympathetic, that presentation of techniques of crime in such detail as to invite imitation shall be avoided, and brutality or physical agony by sight or by sound are not permissible. The code also pledged that law enforcement shall be upheld, that murder or revenge as a motive for murder shall not be presented as justifiable, and that the exposition of sex crimes will be avoided. Although this was the case, the federal government never resolved the problems, which only angered more groups. In 1954, the U.S. Senate, through its subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency, conducted public hearings on TV violence. The subcommittee then began its judicial quest to prove violence on TV caused juvenile delinquency. Over the next decades, many hearings followed this, along with the social critics' research trying to prove the link between crime and entertainment. The 1960s continued on with these same patterns, still ruling off of the National Association of Broadcasters Code of Conduct. However, in the 1970s and 80s, new behaviors on television changed censorship. In the early 1970s, censorship changed dramatically. The method used for measuring the viewing audience became more refined. Broadcasters began to break down the audience based on features such as age, ethnicity, education, and income. Previously excluded topics from TV started to be broadcast regularly, with the popular 1970s sitcom All in the Family being the main show that broke the restrictions of the previous 20 years. Open talk of sexuality appeared in the plot lines. Along with this, ethnicity and bigotry were introduced to American television. The restraint on curse words also broke loose, adding more swear words into the shows, which were not allowed during the 1950s and 60s. After the changes made to television programming in 1971, many advocacy groups, such as gay rights groups, began to approach the networks about their inclusion in TV that was not possible before during the more conservative 1950s and 60s. Although these groups were featured on TV, it turned out to be a mixed blessing due to negative stereotyping and framing of the groups. Conservative groups also did not agree with topics that didn't represent traditional values or beliefs. Therefore, the 1970s became a process of balancing the conflicting values of different social groups on broadcast television. By the early 1980s, the National Association of Broadcasters Code had become outdated and mainly ignored by the broadcasters. In 1982, the code was officially suspended. From 1982 to 1990, TV had no code of professional ethics. Over that period, research showed that although large broadcasters and networks had their own standards, there was no universal guidance. One study favored self-regulation over government regulation as well. In 1990, the National Association of Broadcasters released a new Statement of Principles of Radio and Television Broadcasting. The statement told broadcasters to write their own policies. It also encouraged responsible judgment in the material rather than making a list of what cannot be shown. From the 1990s on, self-regulation was greatly practiced, with the exception of the broad rules the FCC put in place stating there was to be no obscene or indecent material broadcast. In 2004, during the Super Bowl halftime show, Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction caused quite a commotion. The FCC fined CBS $550,000 and the NFL $10 million. Ever since this incident, the FCC has become more strict on regulations. Nowadays, performances on sporting events are censored for sexual innuendo and references more harshly. Over time, censorship regulations on television have changed dramatically. From the conservative 1950s to the colorful 1970s and beyond, programs have changed for both the better and the worse due to the reactions and the reforms in TV censorship.